So I'm really glad to see such a big turnout. People actually remembered to come to this lecture. Is it because you got the Facebook notification, or was it the Twitter, or was it you just are really interested in memory?
Just saw it online.
Oh, you just saw it online?
We did, yeah.
Okay. Well, I would like for this to be as interactive as possible. I didn't arrange my lecture to be done that way, but I'm very happy to stop and pause and clarify and answer any questions as we go along. So please feel free to raise your hand, shout if you're too shy about raising your hand, okay? So just to tell you a little bit more about myself, I specialize in neuropsychology. So that's really a study of brain and behavior relationship. And my work at the epilepsy program at VGH is primarily to work with patients who have epilepsy, of course, who are undergoing investigations for surgery because they have epilepsy that cannot be controlled by medication. So my job is really to assess their thinking skills, their memory, their language, and different problem skills like that for two reasons. One, to see if I can find and pinpoint a location in the brain that may be giving rise to the seizure. And secondly, to provide the patient with additional information about possible cognitive outcome of surgery. Now, cognitive is sort of like a very vague term that people throw around, but nobody really knows what it means. The way I think about cognition is different thinking skills, like problem-solving skills, planning, organization, memory, language, visual skills. Motor skills are part of sort of the cognitive skills. Got it? Okay. So now no lecture on epilepsy and memory can go without remembering this patient, Mr. Henry Molaison. So he's also known as patient HM. And I'm going to start today's lecture by telling you a story about Henry Molaison. So Henry was in his preteens when he started to experience partial seizures. And by his 16th birthday, he had several grand mal seizures. And because of the frequency of his seizures, it became very, very debilitating. He's not able to function properly in his life, like hold down a job or anything like that. And so he was referred to a neurosurgeon based in Connecticut by the name of Dr. William Scoville. Now, Dr. Scoville is a maverick of his time, and he soon discovered after working with Henry for a little while that his seizures are coming from both sides of his medial temporal lobe. And so, with Henry's consent, Dr. Scoville decided to try out an experimental brain surgical procedure by taking out both of his temporal lobe. Now, what he did was, with a drill and a very, very skinny vacuum, he cracked open his skull and used the vacuum to suck out both of Henry's hippocampus. I know. Sounds like a maverick of his time, right? So this picture here shows the location of the hippocampus. Now, on your left, you see the normal brain. And over here, you see that this is the temporal lobe of a normal brain. And this part is the hippocampus. And in HM, or Mr. Molaison's brain, both of his hippocampus have been removed through that vacuum. Okay? So now going back to Henry. So this was back in the 1950s. And that was when the medical world really didn't know very much about what the temporal lobe does or what the hippocampus does. But whatever, because the surgery was successful because Henry no longer has a lot of seizures. So he was having a dramatic decline in the number of seizures he experiences. Awesome, he can have a proper life from now on. However, of course there's the however. Henry's world with regards to his memory stood still. He was able to tell you where he was born and where he grew up, and he was already in his 20s, so no problem. He even knew who his wife is. No problem with that. But he has no way of forming new memories. When you ask him, so how old are you? Even when he was in his 70s, age 70s, he's like, oh, I'm around my mid-20s, because he's perpetually stuck in his mid-20s when he had the surgery, when both of his hippocampus were removed. He will repeat himself a few minutes after telling a story, and he would, best part for you ladies here, always remember his wife in her 20s, even when he was by his dad's bed at 80, okay? So it's not that bad of an idea, I guess. However, we do know that he was unable to form new memories after his hippocampus was removed. Surely there's got to be a link between the hippocampus, both the hippocampus and memory. So since then, Henry has been one of the most studied patients in the entire medical world. Because of him, we were able to find out so much information about memory, the different types of memory, what he could do and what he could not do as a result of the removal of both his hippocampus. So, what do we know after studying Henry for the last 60 years? So we know that there are different types of memory. When you learn how to ride a bicycle, you cannot exactly explain how you do it. You just get on it with your training wheels, ride it a few times, and then gradually you took off the training wheels for a few times, and you figured out how to ride a bike. But you can't exactly explain how you ride a bike. So this type of memory is called procedural memory or implicit memory. And typically, if anything that involves motor learning and motor skills, the basal ganglia and the cerebellum inside the brain are involved in this type of memory. What about your ability to learn facts of this world, like who the Prime Minister is of Canada in 1950, or what the meaning of the word umbrella is? Okay, so this type of memory is called semantic memory. It's really unusual for people with epilepsy or any major form of neurological conditions affecting their memory to lose this kind of memory, except in one type of dementia called semantic dementia. But that's a different story for a different society, okay? And in my work as a neuropsychologist, I often hear of people complaining to me about their short-term memory loss. They tell me that they forget conversations, they forget what movies they saw at the theater a month ago, and they forget where they left their personal belongings, which makes leaving the house very difficult because they have to go around looking for their glasses, their wallets, and their keys before they can leave the house. These are all called episodic memories. And the hippocampus is involved in consolidating both semantic and episodic memory. Now, some of the experts in memory also talk about autobiographical memory. And that is the kind of memory where you remember your childhood or who your best friend was in high school. And it's only in very, very rare cases that people with epilepsy will forget their autobiographical memory. It does happen, but it's not a persistent problem, and it's also very rare. So here's a simple diagram to explain the formation of new memories. So we start by attending to the information, and the brain processes the information before it is encoded for storage in order to be retrieved at a later time. Okay? And now here is a pictorial version of the same thing. So first, you have the frontal lobe attending to and organizing the information that you see and you hear, and then the hippocampus encodes the information for storage in the other parts of the brain. So it's important to know that the hippocampus is really for helping encode and consolidate information. So the information is not stored inside the hippocampus, which would explain why HM still remember a lot of what happened in the past, even though both of his hippocampus have been removed.
Okay, now, I haven't heard of the hippocampus, but my wife had part of her right temporal lobe. Now, where is that in relation to this hippocampus?
Okay.
Because some of the memory issues you're mentioning, I can relate to.
Yep.
So go to the kitchen, put on tea water, and she come back to the living room, and she didn't do it.
Right.
But that's
So,
kind of where the thing is.
yeah.
And we're talking about the, she did a lot of this psychological testing while she was being evaluated. Is that the area that you're involved in?
That's right. So it's neuropsychological evaluation, and
You got a little emotional when we were talking about that part.
okay, I'm sorry.
And so, no, don't apologize. That's a good thing. So, yeah.
Right. So
She was hearing.
yes, that's the hippocampus over there. And that is the part responsible for forming new memories and consolidating new memories. And once the information is taken in, it gets sent to other brain areas to be stored, right? And whatever you're talking about is related to how difficult it is to encode the information, because the hippocampus is...
Coding where there's really the problem. It just seems to be a loss in the moment.
We'll talk about that in just
She doesn't think I'm 20 years old.
Yeah, absolutely, because she still has both one of her hippocampus around, right? So that explains why. I'll talk about that in just a minute, because that is a very, very important point that I would like to raise in just a little bit, okay? Just to continue on your point, what this diagram also shows that people can actually focus and pay attention for a few minutes at a time because of the frontal lobe being able to attend to the information, but it's not able to hold on to the information after a while because the hippocampus is removed. Okay, I'll talk about your point in a little bit. But it also means that depending on the type of epilepsy one has, one can have very, very different types of memory problems. Okay? So the impact of epilepsy on memory depends really on the cause and location of the seizures. So as we learned earlier, the temporal lobe, it's really, really responsible for forming new memories. So people with temporal lobe epilepsies, which is one of the most common type of epilepsies, they tend to have seizures arising from the temporal lobe that can cause disruption in the functioning of the hippocampus. Okay? And so people with temporal lobe epilepsy have trouble consolidating the information they learn, and they show this pattern of rapid forgetting. It may seem as though they got it in the moment, but after a very brief delay, the information is gone. Okay? And a very common cause of temporal lobe epilepsy is called medial temporal sclerosis. So that would be scar tissue in the medial temporal lobe. And there are many different causes of scar tissue in the temporal lobe. One of them is if you are at birth, if you were suffering from any form of breathing difficulty because you were stuck in the birth canal, or you had the umbilical cord wrapped around your neck when you were born, you may suffer a bit of oxygen deprivation in the brain. As a result, it causes scar tissue around the hippocampus, and therefore you may have epilepsy. Not everybody who has scar tissue in the brain have epilepsy, but some people do develop epilepsy. And the second most common type of epilepsy arises from the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe acts like the executive of a company. So what does the executive do? The executive plan, organize, problem solve, and do a lot of multitasking and juggling of different tasks. Which means people with frontal lobe epilepsy can experience executive dysfunction. So problems with executive skills. They may also have trouble learning information because of poor planning and organization, meaning the brain has a hard time organizing the information that they see or they hear into meaningful ways for the brain to store. But once the information gets in, they are actually able to retain those information that they had learned. You can also improve their ability to remember information by providing some external structure to scaffold their ability to learn the information. So a very important piece for me as a neuropsychologist is the functioning of the left and the right hemisphere of the brain. So for most right-handed people, their left brain is the expert in processing verbal information, and their right brain is the expert in processing visual information. That's for most right-handed people. If you're left-handed, it's a little unclear what your language representation is in your brain, so it might be a mixed picture. So people in my field call that material-specific memory, verbal versus visual, so material-specific memory. So we know that verbal memory is encoded by the left hippocampus and visual memory is encoded by the right hippocampus, again for most right-handed people. So people with visual memory impairments are most likely going to complain about problems with finding their way around or recognizing people's faces. Whereas people with verbal memory impairments are more likely to complain about being able to remember conversations or books that they read. Now, the knowledge about material-specific memory is very, very important when I assess somebody for surgery because we do not want to see another person like HM. We want to make sure that whatever brain tissue that we take out, those are unhealthy brain tissue, and whatever that is left on the other side of the brain is actually able to support brain functioning. So for example, if you have a right-sided surgery as a result of scar tissue on the right temporal lobe, odds are you may suffer some memory decline if you are right-handed, but it is very, very unlikely that it will be so bad that you cannot remember your childhood or you are not able to form any new memories at all. That is only if I, as a neuropsychologist, find that your left hippocampus, which means your verbal memory, remains really strong. However, if I find that after doing my assessment, your verbal memory is also very weak and your visual memory is weak, then we have a problem because if we take out the weak memory, the weak hippocampus on the right side, the other side of your brain is probably not able to support memory. So we may end up having somebody who almost resembles HM, Henry Molaison, but not quite to the extent because there are still some part of the hippocampus on one side that may still be healthy enough to support some formation of new memories. So in a way, does that answer your question why it's not so bad that you're not able to remember anything at all, but there's still a lot of trouble staying in the moment and being able to hold on to information over a longer period of time?
You're enlightening me. I'll put it that way.
Okay. I know it's very confusing because I go left side, right side, verbal, visual, but just bear in mind when I do the assessment, all I'm trying to do is I'm using verbal memory to identify the possibility that it is your left hippocampus that is still very healthy. And I'm using visual memory as an indicator that the right hippocampus is or is not healthy. Okay? So the way I do that is by looking again at verbal and visual memory using different tasks. So one way that I would measure verbal memory is using a list learning task. So for example, I will read a list of words to people, and after I finish reading the word list, I'll have them tell me what all the words were on the list. And I do this over several times because I want to see this nice pattern of learning curve. And then after a delay, I will also get people to tell me all the words that they had learned. Now, for people with frontal lobe epilepsy, you may find that they have this flat learning curve. They're not able to take in the information. They show this pattern of learning inefficiencies. However, after a delay, whatever meager information they did learn, they're able to retain it over time. On the other hand, for some people with temporal lobe epilepsy, you do see that they have this very nice learning curve immediately after I present the word list to them. But after a half an hour delay, a lot of the information that they had originally learned had been lost. Another way I do that is by getting people to remember stories. So I'll read the story and then have people remember it immediately after I say it, as well as after a delay. We would also expect the same pattern, except this time, because this story is meaningful and is given to you within a structure, I would expect that people with frontal lobe epilepsy would do much better, whereas people with temporal lobe epilepsy continues to do poorly remembering the story. In terms of visual memory, I may decide to present a display with different simple designs on it and get the person to draw it out for me from memory. Again, the same pattern of getting them to learn those display over several trials, and then after a delay, get them to draw those pictures again from memory. Or I can get them to copy a complicated figure and try to remember this complicated figure from memory after a delay. So the idea here is this is also a very structured picture, so you might be able to do a much better job remembering it than some random display of simple designs. And now, the severity of memory impairment in people with epilepsy really depends on the type, the frequency, the cause, and the chronicity of the seizures. The experts are really not in full agreement about the impact of frequent seizures on various thinking skills. We do know that people who only get auras, meaning they do not lose awareness, they just get different sensations or different visual imageries depending on the location of the seizures. Those type of seizures are least likely to affect cognitive skills over the long run. However, if you have complex partial seizures, and I'm talking about those staring spells where sometimes people may start blinking or they may start making mouth movements or participate in complex behaviors without awareness, or if they have frequent generalized tonic-clonic seizure, also known as grand mal seizures, these people are more likely to have some impact on their thinking skills. Also, people who get seizures very frequently are more likely to have more impact on their thinking skills, and people who have frequent seizures over a very long period of time also have a higher likelihood of having some impact on their memory skills. What we can definitely agree amongst all the different experts is people who experience status epilepticus, the last word over there, which means prolonged seizures that sometimes we need to be terminated by medication. So anything that goes beyond 15, 20 minutes or even longer, we would be really concerned about those kind of seizures affecting your hippocampus. Here comes the hippocampus again, because the hippocampus is the most sensitive structure in the brain to any kind of brain insult. So people with...
Is this the generalized memory loss that you're talking about? Is this cumulative? Is it delayed onset?
Okay, so with this status epilepticus, it is pretty much within the next few days, you will see the sudden drop. Yeah, with all the other ones, the experts are really not in agreement about whether or not if seizures really have an impact. Part of it is because studies looking at long-term cognitive outcome of seizures is very, very difficult to conduct because, as I said, it all depends on the type, the frequency, and also other factors that I'm going to be talking about in a while. So that makes it really, really difficult for experts to agree, okay, yes, for sure, seizures definitely have an impact on memory versus not. But we do know for sure that for people who experience status epilepticus, more than often, they have this sudden drop in their memory after each episode.
And that's not recovered?
You might see that they may recover a little bit, but never back to their normal state again.
Well, at the end, the year before November, after
Before the surgery.
it took a week or more after like one surgery, after seizures. It would take over a week before I would feel back to normal.
Mm-hmm. It's very common for people to have that experience. And I do know that a lot of our patients say that they never really feel back to normal again after each episode. But again, it really depends.
You know what I'm saying? Like, be able to do most of the things.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah.
That way it was not normal.
It would still be very difficult, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, still not back to your normal self before you started having seizures. And again,
Well,
part
I was 10.
Hmm?
I was 10 when I started having seizures.
it is a very long time. I will show you some data in a little bit, okay? Where was I? Right. So there are a lot of other factors that can affect seizures and memory. One of them would be medication. We know that a lot of the different seizure medications have notable effect on brain functioning and lots of different thinking skills. So we know that the older anti-epileptic medications such as phenobarbital or valproic acid, those have more notable effects on your thinking skills, such as people tend to complain about thinking very, very slowly, or they may complain that they are not able to pay attention and concentrate as well. They may also talk about having memory issues as a result of taking those seizure medications. Now, the newer versions, the newer generations of seizure medications, they are much better when it comes to thinking side effects, except for one particular one that is notorious for causing notable word-finding problems. It's called topiramate. However, whatever decision you make about your seizure medication, it needs to be balanced against seizure control, because if you continue to have seizures, you may continue to suffer that decline in your cognitive skills as well. Now, we also know that if you have a slow increase in your medications, in your seizure medications, chances are your body will tolerate and will be able to get used to the medication, and so you will not be experiencing as much of the cognitive side effects than if you increase your medications very suddenly. Okay. So people with epilepsy are also very frequently suffering from sleep problems. Sometimes it's because they have nighttime seizures, so they will have a lot of disruption in their sleeping pattern because of the seizures themselves. But there are also some brain chemistry that takes place when one has seizures, even when they don't happen at night. Just because you have epilepsy, there might be some change in your sleep architecture. I believe this talk was given last month by an expert in sleep disorders, so I will not try to pretend that I know what I'm talking about. And I don't know about you, because in general, if I do not have a good full 8 hours of sleep, I really cannot function in the daytime. I see some people nodding and raising their hand in agreement. And so we know that sleep is very important for good functioning of your thinking skills. Now, good quality sleep, we also know that something happens to our brain when we sleep at night, because somehow it helps us remove some of the gunk that accumulates in the daytime. I'm talking about toxins that can accumulate in the daytime. So for people, let's say in their later life, people who have good quality sleep are less likely to develop diseases like Alzheimer's disease. Sleep. Good quality sleep, not just longer sleep. You can be in bed for 10 hours, but if you're not having good quality sleep, it's not going to be helpful either. Okay, so lastly, people with epilepsy can also frequently experience mood issues, partly because they're reacting to having to deal with having seizures and all the limitations placed on having this really chronic and unpredictable condition. Also, because there's some chemical changes in the brain, and therefore they can also have different mood issues as a result of having seizures. So people with epilepsy tend to complain of subjective memory problems. Again, I'm talking about subjective memory problems. And these subjective memory problems can be compounded when there is also mood issues. So here's a study that look at that. Here's a very complicated table with lots of numbers, and I promise you I'm not going to show you too many of these, just probably 3 slides in total, or 4. So now this table shows the correlation between subjective memory complaints and various mood and anxiety self-reports, as well as objective cognitive test results among healthy people as well as among people with different kinds of epilepsy. Okay, so now the item in this box here shows a significant positive correlation between depression and anxiety and subjective memory complaints. So people who have memory complaints are the ones who are more likely to suffer from mood and anxiety problems. It doesn't matter if you're a healthy person or people with epilepsy. However, if you look at this next box here, only the healthy people show a correlation between their objective memory test performance and their subjective memory complaints. So for people who do poorly on the objective memory test, they also tend to complain more of memory problems. Makes sense. But the ones with epilepsy, there's no correlation between their subjective memory complaints and their objective test performance. So just to show that it's really specific to memory alone, all the other measures looking at attention, visual skills, and general intelligence, those also do not have any correlation with subjective memory complaints.
Excuse me, the R, there's a single R means...
That's the correlation coefficient. Yeah. And so the take-home message for this is there are also studies that shows mood can improve your subjective memory complaints. So as soon as your mood issue is being treated, your subjective memory complaints also go away. And I see that quite frequently. Very often I'll see patients who complain a lot of memory problems, but they do really, really well on their objective memory tests. But they are very, very depressed. So I do believe that there is that correlation between people suffering from mood problems and feeling as though their memory is really bad, even though their memory isn't bad. So what about brain surgery? Of course, brain surgery may cause some changes in your thinking skills. But it also all depends on the area of the brain that is being removed. So as part of what I do, I look at people's memory using my verbal versus visual memory test. And then I make predictions about possible changes in their memory depending on their other investigation. So again, for people who have mesotemporal sclerosis, scar tissue, in the right side of the brain, they are likely to suffer memory loss, but it would not be to the extent that they cannot form any more new memories. But the more interesting thing is mood and seizure freedom seems to be the most predictive of memory complaints. So even after a brain surgery, there are some people who have objective evidence of memory loss on tests. They actually do not complain of memory problems as long as they can get good seizure control with surgery and as long as they do not have any mood problems after surgery. They can also experience some improvement in other thinking skills in areas of the brain where there was no seizure focus and where surgery did not take place. So if you think about your brain as a giant apartment building and the seizure focus as that very, very irritating and noisy neighbor, you can't exactly function very well even in your own apartment when you have that very, very noisy neighbor. So what happens after you remove that very noisy neighbor? You do much better, right? Same idea as the brain. So here's an example of someone who underwent right-sided temporal lobe epilepsy. Again, everybody may have different results because the whole investigation is all individualized. So if you look at the black box on the screen, those are the pre-surgical results across the different thinking skills: general intellectual functioning, attention, processing speed, executive functions, language, visual skills, and verbal and visual memory. Now that dashed line across the graph shows the level at which I would consider that function to be impaired. So any bar that goes below the dashed line shows impaired functioning in that specific area. So pre-surgically, this person has good functioning across the board. And then this person went through with right-sided surgery. And as we know, right side, visual information, right? So you see that the visual spatial skill represented by this lighter green bar after surgery is now in the impaired range. And then you have the visual memory, both immediate and after delay, to be also in the impaired range. So it really goes along with what we know and what we would expect with a right-sided surgery. Whereas all the other functions over here remain pretty much stable. So this person actually has reduction in seizure after the surgery, and this person does not have any mood issues. So interestingly, despite whatever we see as an objective decline, this person also does not have any memory complaints at all.
What's the standard deviation of this T-score?
One standard deviation is 10 points.
10.
Yeah. So what about, go ahead.
35 provides 50%.
No, well, so the way we we come up with all these scores are not based on how well a person does on the test. So it's not like you fail the test if you get 50% and below, but more in terms of comparison to other healthy people of very similar background. At least from the pre-surgical perspective, we do not have any pre-epilepsy data to compare to, so we don't really know what the person is functioning at prior to having all these medical conditions. So the best we can do is to compare people's performance to other people who are just like them, who are healthy. And the best thing we can do based on what we know about our test measures are to compare people who are of very similar age, educational level, gender, those demographic background variables.
So that chart was just about right brain surgery?
Correct. That was just a right brain surgery.
Okay. Because I've had left brain and it's what applies there doesn't.
It would not apply exactly, but it gets a little bit more complicated depending on whether or not you're left or right-handed, because we know that most right-handed people, over 98% of right-handed people, have their left side as the expert in verbal information. However, for left-handed people, only about 60 to 70% of them have their language center or the left brain as the expert in verbal information, same as verbal memory. Okay, which means there's still a large proportion of people who are left-handed who either have their language in either the right side or both sides. So the way the brain represents language becomes a little unclear for people who are left-handed, which also has a lot of implications for the kind of surgery that they decide to go through. Because let's say if I find that your language center, you're left-handed and your language center is on the right side, not the typical one, then you are going through with right-sided surgery, then we would expect changes in your verbal memory more so than your visual memory, just because the right side is now the expert in the verbal information.
So I'm left-handed and I have left brain surgery, but I found everything improved greatly after the surgery.
It might suggest that you may not have your language center in the left side. So that's why there's not as much of those verbal memory decline that we would expect with a left-sided surgery. And it is because it is the non-dominant side of the brain, we would expect that the other brain is able to support a lot of the functioning. And just like the example I give with the big apartment building, things improve because that irritating, noisy neighbor has been removed.
Is there any difference in the rate of epilepsy among right-handed or left-handed?
The rate
Yeah.
of epilepsy,
How
you know
many
what?
there are?
You know what? That's a very good point. I actually don't know that. But that's a good point. I probably should look that up. How about in old age? What if you continue to have seizures, maybe infrequently, over a very long time? Are you expecting to have massive decline in your memory to the point where you look as though you have Alzheimer's disease? Well, I said earlier, those studies are very, very difficult to conduct. In fact, we actually do not have any studies on people who have undergone surgery and followed up 20 or 30 years after the surgery to see how they fare cognitively 20 years after the surgery. We do not have any studies on that, at least not that I know of. But that would be a very, very important study to conduct just so we can inform people about what to expect. Regardless of how difficult it is, a group of scientists tried to conduct a study about epilepsy in old age by using a cross-sectional sample of older adults with epilepsy and comparing them to matched control healthy older adults, and also compare them to people who suffer from mild cognitive impairment, also known as MCI. Now, MCI is the intermediate state between healthy aging and dementia. So people who suffer from MCI do not have cognitive problems that are as bad as somebody with dementia, but their memory issues are also not similar to healthy aging. So it's not because they are getting older, that's why their memory is bad. It is because they have a separate condition called mild cognitive impairment. And these are the very people who are also at risk of developing dementia over a longer period of time, MCI people, not epilepsy. Okay, so now here is my second to the last graph. So this is based on a measure that we call the dementia rating scale, which is a measure of general thinking skills. Now, again, the dotted line represents the cutoff score for dementia. Anything that goes below that dotted lines represent somebody potentially having a dementia. As you can see, older adults with epilepsy actually do worse on this general thinking skills measure compared to people with MCI, and people with MCI do worse than older adults who are healthy. So we do know that from this alone, over a long period of time, seniors with epilepsy probably suffer more decline in their thinking skills than people who are healthy. Now, this sample is a sample of adults who are older than 60 years old, and for the people with epilepsy, they have either partial seizures with or without grand mal seizures. They have had at least 10 years, and some of them have over 30 years of seizures. They have at least one seizure a month, and about half of them are on 2 or more different medications. So for people who have this kind of characteristics, this is probably what we will be seeing over the long run in terms of their thinking skills.
Sorry, do you know how many people were involved?
Yeah, so for this senior with epilepsy, it was a sample of 26 people with epilepsy. So it's a small study. So it's a matched sample, so it's 26, 26, and 26. Yeah, it's a small study. Again, very, very difficult to conduct studies such as this for a number of different methodological issues. But at least we have some data. Okay, now the next graph, and my very last graph, I think, looks only at memory alone. Okay, so this is based on the story learning, the story memory measure that I talked about earlier, where I read a story and then they have to recall the story immediately and after a delay. So the dark green bars represent immediate recall, whereas the light green bars represent recall of the story after a delay. So as you can see here, even healthy people lose some information after a delay. But for the people with MCI and the seniors with epilepsy, they seem to lose quite a bit more information, and they actually perform at the same level, the seniors with epilepsy perform at the same level as people with MCI, which also means their memory is not as bad as somebody with dementia. So what can I do to protect brain health? I think this is something really important. And there are a number of variety of different things people can do. And these recommendations are good for both healthy people as well as those with neurological conditions, including epilepsy. So for people who do not have epilepsy, don't think you can tune out now, because you have to pay attention right now in order to protect your brain health. And don't think because you're young, you're safe, because we also know that studies showed if you start practicing all these recommendations at a younger age, you are at a much lower risk of developing dementia at your older age. Okay, so start doing them now. So what are they? Now, there are a number of different studies that support physical exercise, especially aerobic exercise. It is the number one thing anybody and everybody can do for their brain health. Even walking a few extra blocks a day, every day, can actually have measurable impact on your memory. Healthy people who exercise on a regular basis are more likely to delay the onset of dementia than those who do not exercise. There are also some studies in the dementia and the Alzheimer's literature that looks at people at autopsy. So this group of people were assessed before they died, not a few days before they died, but the few years before they died, and they didn't have any symptoms of dementia at all. They're still functioning really well at home and doing really well. However, at autopsy, the scientists discovered that, hey, these really healthy people actually show pathology of Alzheimer's disease. And what they did discover is these are the very people who do a lot of different lifestyle modifications, like exercise, aerobic exercise, on a very regular basis. That is the number one thing anybody and everybody can do for their brain health. Now, in the past, physicians have always poo-pooed the idea of exercise for people with epilepsy because they're always worried that you're going to trigger a seizure if you have exercise. Well, there are a small little group of people who do have exercise-induced seizures, but for the majority of people with epilepsy, that is not the case. There are a few studies that looked at the impact of regular physical aerobic exercise on seizure. What they've discovered is regular aerobic exercise increase the threshold for seizure, meaning you're less likely to get seizures, and it reduces the frequency of seizures. And so unless you have well-established exercise-induced epilepsy, it is part of the recommendation that everybody does include some form of aerobic exercise in their daily routine. It doesn't have to be joining a triathlon or run a marathon or anything crazy like that. It can be if you are up to it, but it doesn't need to be just walking a few extra blocks every day. So getting off at 3 bus stops before your regular bus stops and walking that distance will have measurable impact on your thinking skills. And ideally, we would recommend 30 sustained minutes of aerobic exercise at least 3 times a week for optimal brain health. And I say sustained 30 sustained minutes because very frequently I will have people tell me, oh yeah, I walk to work for 10 minutes and then I walk home for work for 10 minutes, so that's 20 minutes. So I just need to do 10 more minutes at random, like maybe over lunch hour. That's good, so don't get me wrong, that's good too, but ideally you want to do 30 sustained minutes and get your heart pumping. Exactly, don't stretch it out over the whole day. It's good, but not as good. Those kind of regimen is also very good for cardiovascular health as well as psychological health. So get all your friends and family out jogging with you and get your heart pumping. But before you start any exercise regimen, make sure you check with your physician to ensure that you actually have the physical health and physical ability to participate in the exercise that you choose. So in addition to exercise, different dietary factors are also protective of brain health. We know that food that are rich in antioxidants and omega-3 fatty acids are very, very healthy brain food. So eat more berries, eat more nuts, eat more fresh produce, eat more fish, oily fish, not fish and chips. Did you have something to?
I was just saying, just fruits and vegetables are the key ones, I've been told.
Correct.
Especially if you're overweight, you want to lose it. Just stick to those two.
Absolutely, and be careful about the nuts because they're very high in calories. But in general, different nuts like walnuts and almonds, those are actually pretty good in different fatty acids as well. Those are the healthy fats, and as well as antioxidants. Different spices are also good for health. We know that cinnamon is good for health, as well as curry. And again, I do not mean cinnamon bun. Not cinnamon bun, but the cinnamon. Cinnamon is good. I actually have a lot of people say, "Oh, good, I love cinnamon bun."
You hear what you want to hear.
Well, absolutely, absolutely. So vegetables that are dark and brightly colored are also very nutrient rich. So those are the good ones. Okay.
Finished with diet?
Yes.
I just had a question about, we're kind of new to this world, so they might all know the answer, but about ketogenic diet?
Ketogenic diet. So that's more
Like
common.
that?
Yeah, that's more common among younger people, and I'm not actually familiar with the ketogenic diet because I belong to the adult world, and which is really unfortunate because everybody grow from young to adult, so I ought to know more about that, but I really don't. Sorry.
That's okay.
Dr. Anita Data from Children's Hospital is likely going to be doing a lecture in 2015 on the ketogenic diet. We do have one of our first newsletters archived on our website that has information on the ketogenic diet along with an information sheet, but there will be a lecture next year on the diet specifically.
Perfect. So I don't even need to know. Well, I will come so that I will know. How about that? Okay. So now, if you remember, I mentioned earlier the importance of good quality sleep, and that chronic poor sleep is going to be deleterious to brain health. And so what I will encourage everybody to do is to practice sleep hygiene. Make sure you maintain a sleep routine by going to bed and waking up the same hour every day, including the weekend. And also include some bedtime routine before you go to bed, like perhaps drinking chamomile tea or taking a warm bath before bedtime, because those will help you relax and it helps to induce sleep. Also, avoid caffeinated products like tea, coffee, chocolate, cola, energy drinks, many hours before bedtime. I personally cannot have any caffeinated product after 12 p.m., but I also go to bed fairly early. So that's something to think about.
My dad would suggest years ago that you have to drink nothing after, no coffee after lunch.
Well, that's exactly what I do.
Drink?
Yeah, that's what I do. No caffeinated product after lunch. But again, personal choice. And have your emotionally charged conversation with your partner earlier in the day, not in bed. Pillow talk is not always a good idea. And also, for some of you here, avoid watching Netflix on your laptop or tablet in bed. So finally, ensure that your bedroom is dark and quiet and cool enough for sleep. I know it seems as though it's so hot here you can fall asleep right now, but it actually doesn't help you maintain your sleep. You will probably wake up in sweat and have trouble falling back asleep if it's too hot. So maintain a cool temperature in your bedroom. If you have any electronics in your bedroom, make sure it doesn't emit any light or anything that flickers. Otherwise, it may confuse your brain into thinking that it's daylight hours and it's time to wake up and do stuff. And in general, if you find that you cannot fall asleep after 20 minutes, then what you need to be doing is not try and go, "Oh no, it's 1 o'clock, I have 5 more hours before I wake up. Oh no, it's 2 o'clock, I have 4 more hours before I wake up," because that's the worst thing you can do, absolutely. So instead of doing that, get out of bed, walk around your house or your apartment if you're like me, do some light stretches, and that will help you relax a little bit before you try going to bed again.
another.
Absolutely. So break that up, break your sleep up. I don't mean sleep, but if you cannot fall asleep, break that up so that you can do something else, distract yourself before you try and go back to sleep. Because if you don't do that, you might end up getting really panicky, and that's going to go into the whole cycle of I can't sleep, why can't I sleep? I need to do so much stuff tomorrow, I should go to bed now. No, it's 2 o'clock. Oh no, it's 3 o'clock. Oh no, if I sleep now, I only get 2 hours of sleep. Oh, okay, I better sleep. And then it's time to wake up. So don't do that. So instead, get up, do something. Try not to watch TV because the light from the TV is going to, again, trick your brain into thinking it's time to wake up.
Another good tip is having soft classical music.
Very quietly for a short period, and then make sure you turn it off. Otherwise, it might wake you up in the middle of the night too, if you do eventually fall asleep. Now, if your sleep remains poor despite very, very rigorous effort at practicing your sleep hygiene, you might want to consider talking to a psychologist who specializes in behavioral treatment of sleep problems. You can also talk to your physician, but I'm a psychologist. Of course, I'm going to root for my colleagues by saying there are other options other than medications, but medication works too. I'm looking straight into the camera. Okay. So if you find that your memory is declining, there are several different strategies that you can use and try. So one, chunking. Now, it's much easier to remember these 9 letters if you try. It's much harder to remember these 9 letters if you try to remember them like that. But once you put them into chunks, it becomes much easier. So bear in mind that the convention is we can remember 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information. So right now we just have to remember 3 pieces as opposed to 9 pieces. Everybody has smartphones these days. Smartphones have very different functions. And the one that I like to use is the calendar function. Very often, the calendar function also has email notification, or it sends you text reminders, or it pops up on your phone to remind you that, hey, it's time to take your medication. Hey, you have an appointment coming up. So that's a good one.
Forgive me. CFL is not Canadian football.
Well,
I was gonna say, did you do that on purpose?
I did that on purpose. Yeah, I did that on purpose. So, one other thing about smartphones, a lot of people know, but you don't use it. But that's the voice recording function on your smartphone. It's very handy to have that voice recording function if you need to make a very quick shopping list. Active learning. So you want to try to make the information you want to learn as rich as possible. You may also consider making mind maps or thought bubbles on a piece of paper with all the different concepts and map them together as a way to learn the information. And always remember repetition, repetition, repetition. Just keep repeating and you will get it eventually. Can also use mnemonics and visual cues to help you remember names and people's faces. So for example, if your friend or this person that you just met, his name is Tom, he looks really tall, he has this strange spiky hair, so you might come up with a mnemonic. Tom is an accountant with spiky hair that looks like a troll. Something like that to make it more meaningful. Okay, nobody has spiky hair here. You can also use one memory place for all your belongings or all the different items, but always make sure that you return those items back to their place immediately after use. I personally like this other one where I have a big giant bowl beside my door in the house, not outside, in the house. So as soon as I walk in, I just dump all my wallet, my keys, my coins, my glasses, everything into that big bowl by the door. So before I leave the house for my appointment, I don't have to go around everywhere looking for my personal belongings.
Memory is in quotations, any particular reason?
Yeah, memory place. So it's not exactly using your head, but more in terms of...
Every single time.
correct.
Thank you.
Yes. Now, make sure that you keep your workplace tidy and neat to reduce visual distraction. Very often, people with epilepsy also have trouble with focus and attention, and they can get distracted very easily. So if you're working on something really important like filing your taxes or anything like that, make sure there's no distraction, whether it's visual distraction or the radio or the TV going. Just to make sure that there's nothing that take you away from your task at hand. And then the last thing, the method of loci. Okay, here's what we do. So the method of loci uses spatial information to help you with your memory. So let's say you're hoping to remember your shopping list. And so you want to use spatial information to aid your memory. What I'd like you to do is to picture a very familiar place, perhaps your living room, because there are different pieces of furniture. Picture them in your head. And then as you walk around the room, place your grocery items at different locations. So when I walk through the door, I will hang a dangling bunch of carrots by the picture frame, by the door. And then I will place my round apples on the drawer beneath that round wheel looking thing on my wall. And then I will place my peppers beneath a hot table lamp so that I can help them grow. And then, oh yes, my daughter wants grapes, and that's her favorite fruit. And I will place the fruit, her favorite grapes, on her favorite armchair. And then I'll walk mentally again and see that I need to get asparagus. So I'll place my asparagus on that bowl of pebbles on the coffee table. It's almost like they're growing out of the pebbles. And then I will put some tomatoes on that white couch, because it's a bad idea to put tomato on a white couch in case you stain it. Okay, so that's my grocery list. And then now I'm just going to go to the grocery store. And when I get to the grocery store, I'm going to mentally walk through my living room again. As I walk through the door, I'm going to see the picture frame and go, oh yeah, those dangling bunch of carrots. And then by the time I walk to the wheel by the wall, I'm like, oh yes, round apples and hot table lamp, peppers. And I see my daughter's favorite armchair, of course, her favorite fruit. And then I see that big bowl of pebbles. What can be growing from the bowl of pebbles? Oh, those funny looking asparagus. And then as I walk towards the couch, I was going to sit down on my couch, and I remember, oh, I don't want to do that because I do not want to stain my couch with tomatoes.
And what does it mean if you come home with a whole bunch of new furniture and paintings?
Then we really have a problem with your strategy. But yes, so now I have my grocery list, I hope, instead of a whole bunch of furniture. So that's the method of loci, utilizing familiar spatial information. That's really just an example, and it requires a lot of practice before you can get really full benefit from using this method. So keep trying, keep trying, keep trying. Now, if you want to know more about your cognitive strengths and weaknesses, talk to the neuropsychologist. The neuropsychologist has expertise in assessing your cognitive strengths and weaknesses in order to make recommendations that are individualized for you. So if you want to pay privately, you can call a lot of different private practice neuropsychologists. There are also hospital-based neuropsychologists, but you probably need to get a referral from your physician to see a hospital-based neuropsychologist. All right, so some final take-home messages from everything that we've covered today. Memory complaints in epilepsy is dependent on the cause, the type, the frequency, and chronicity of seizures. Seizure medications, sleep problems, mood disorders, and brain surgery can impact memory. Improved mood and seizure control are most predictive of memory complaints after surgery. And if you continue to have memory troubles, use compensatory strategies. But remember, you need to practice, practice, practice. And the last but not least, behavioral methods, lifestyle modification. So physical aerobic exercises and dietary factors improve brain health. Thank you.